If you've stuck through my videos this long, you've sat through some pretty complicated subject matter. What we're going to cover today is simple, but in all its simplicity it is ignored far too often, even in the lower echelons of tournament Scrabble play. That's because although it's easy to do, it's also easy to screw up. Many novices only consider the game information that they can see, that is, the tiles on their rack and the arrangement on the board. However, the unseen information is also useful. The more game information that you take into consideration, the closer to optimal your play will be. While it's not possible to know the tiles on your opponent's rack, it is possible to know the combination of tiles on their rack and in the bag. This video will explain how to account for these unseen tiles using tile tracking, and more importantly, what you can do with this new game information. You may be familiar with card counting in blackjack, or tracking discards in rummy and other card games, but probably have never done this, as A, it's often illegal, or B, it's very difficult to go through all the mental gymnastics needed to keep track of those cards. Tile tracking is directly comparable, except that it's actually encouraged in gameplay and can be done without too much mental gymnastics. Expert players have a list of all 100 tiles on their score sheet. As each tile is played, they tick it off the list. It's really as simple as that. Alternatively, and what you often see with more casual gamers who don't have their own score sheet, is that they'll write down every letter from A to blank, and every time that letter is played, they'll keep a tally next to the letter. Now this involves memorizing the distribution, which is a good idea, but because of that and other factors, it often leads to a lot of mistakes when tile tracking. I don't recommend it, and would push you guys towards actually creating a full tile tracking sheet where each tile, not each letter, is accounted for. Making a mistake in tile tracking can actually be a lot worse than not tracking at all. After all, trying to find and fix these mistakes can put a real stranglehold on your time at the end of live games. Luckily, the Internet Scrabble Club, which I've mentioned before, does all the tile tracking for you automatically. Words with Friends and Facebook Scrabble don't currently have any sort of tile tracking feature, even though Facebook will be releasing one shortly, which you'll probably have to pay for. So in any account, you should probably learn to do this manually. To do this, write out the tile distribution on a piece of paper multiple times, and make sure that you keep track of which tracking sheet goes with which of your games. Alternatively, you can find a link in the description below to a PDF where I've included a bunch of distributions for your crossing off pleasure. Scrabble players can get pretty defensive over what kind of arrangement they like their tiles to be in, so I've included a few down there so you can choose which one best suits your needs and style of play. Tile tracking is easy once you get the hang of it, and don't worry, you will get the hang of it even if you make mistakes in all of your first 10 attempts to track. What to do with that information is a little bit more difficult, and I've hinted at a few of these in my past few videos. There are 42 vowels and 56 consonants in the bag, and this coincides quite naturally to the 2 to 3 ratio between vowels and consonants that is natural for the English language. If vowels and consonants came out of the bag evenly, there'd be no problem. But what's often seen towards the end of the game is that the unseen tiles will be very heavy in the consonants or the vowels. At the end of the game, through tile tracking, you may see that the unseen tiles are about 75% vowels, giving you a higher chance of drawing vowels when you refresh your rack. Keeping a consonant-heavy rack will help compensate for the vowels you're likely to draw. You may remember this board from my third video on tile valuation. Here, the only smart move is to exchange. The question is, what to exchange? Knowing that I'm much more likely to draw vowel heavy, I'm going to keep more consonants than I normally would. Here, I would definitely keep the R and the T, plus one of the other letters. Knowing what you do now about tile valuation, and being able to see the board, I'll let you decide what you think that third tile should be, and guess down in the comments. This logic can also be applied to individual letters. As we discussed before, duplicate tiles have terrible synergy and can really bog down your rack. To avoid duplicate tiles on your rack, play away letters that are still heavy in the bag since you have a higher chance of drawing them. See 5 R's and 1 L in the bag? Then it's probably a better idea to play raised instead of lazed. In this example, I'm going to consider two situations that I found myself in my last tournament. On this board, I found myself with 3 eyes on my rack. Always a terrible situation to be in. Now, I look at the tracking and I can see that while there's only about 20 tiles left in the bag, 5 of those are eyes. At this point, if I were to keep any eyes on my rack, there's a very good chance that I will just draw more. Therefore, trying to get rid of as many eyes as possible is my key strategy here. I have 2 ways of doing that. Either I can look for a word that gets rid of at least 2 of my eyes while still scoring decently, or I can just throw in, get rid of my 3 eyes and hope that I don't draw more than 1 out of the bag. This game seems to have a pretty similar situation, 3 eyes on my rack. That's never a good thing. However, it's less of a bad thing when looking at the tiles still unseen. Here we can find out that the 3 eyes on my rack are in fact the last 3 eyes in the game. Now don't feel like you have to conserve those 3 eyes. After all, having 3 eyes in your rack is always a bad thing. Unless of course they're accompanied with 2 O's and 2 D's to make oidioid, one of my favorite words in Scrabble. The difference in consideration here is that you should definitely not exchange. You don't need to get rid of all 3 eyes, as you won't be drawing another one. Getting rid of 2 of the eyes, or even just 1 of them, will be sufficient in this scenario. If you're familiar with your eye dumps, you should be able to see that with all that information, playing this word is my best play. When a tile becomes completely exhausted from the unseen tiles, there's obviously a certainty that your opponent will not have one of these tiles for the rest of the game. This allows you to make ordinarily dangerous plays with confidence. Hookable words can be played up to open space or even up to a triple word score line without having to take that defensive knock to your equity. In the same strain, if you have a monopoly on 1 letter, this can make an even better way for setting you up for some pretty big points. This is an offensive strategy we covered a few videos ago. Let's look at this board. I have an obvious zonal on my rack, maybe zona if there's a good place for that, and there's 2 good places that I can make a good Z play. One is here, zonal on the top right. Now this places the Z in the triple word scored lane, and it's almost a certainty that your opponent's going to come back with a really good counter score. Alternatively, you can take a dozen or so points less and play zonal over here on the left side. Why would you do that? Well, not only is it more defensive, but it's also more offensive. If you keep the A on your rack, and remember that zonal takes the A front hook for azonal, then you can conserve this A on your rack, which just happens to be the last A in the game, and make good use of this triple word score on your next or subsequent turns. The volatility of the game isn't only determined by the board, as was discussed in the last video, but also by unseen tiles. High face value tiles, such as the JQXZ, as well as high equity tiles, such as the S and the blank, give higher chances of bigger scores in the remainder of the game. Their presence in the unseen tiles can greatly increase the volatility of the game. Let's look at an example. Here are 2 boards, seemingly identical, except in one, the 2 bingos that have been played have utilized the 2 blanks, whereas in the other, both blanks are still unseen. If you're in the lead by about 30 points, which board would you prefer? Probably the one without the blanks unseen. By not seeing those blanks, it's likely that your opponent could pick them up and still make that comeback that he needs to. It is important to note that the density of power tiles in the bag affects a strategy called tile turnover. I'll touch on this in a later video. Knowing how far along a game is can usually be gleaned by how full the board is or by how many turns have been played. In almost all online Scrabble programs, there'll be an active count of the tiles remaining in the bag. However, in live play, it's not so easy to know this information. In the end game, or the pre-end game, where less than 10 tiles remain in the bag, knowing exactly how many tiles that is crucial for many reasons, all that will be discussed in the next video. Of course, this shouldn't replace the actual physical counting of tiles, i.e. sticking your hand in the bag and counting for yourself. In fact, comparing the 2 results, that which you get from physical counting and that which you get from tile tracking, is almost always how tile tracking mistakes are discovered. The majority of tracking mistakes are under tracking, where you completely forget to track a word or a letter, or over-tracking, where you accidentally count a letter twice, perhaps because it was played on a board and played through with an 8-letter bingo. Mistracking, or crossing off the wrong letter in lieu of another one, is actually less common, which is good because it can't be detected through tile counting. The final and inarguably the most beneficial use of tile tracking is in the end game when the bag is empty. Here, the unseen tiles comprise solely of the tiles on your opponent's rack, and so knowing exactly what is on their rack is a given as long as you've done your tile tracking. There is an awful lot to cover here, and so I've saved everything for the next video on the end game and pre-end game. When I first started playing Club Scrabble about a year ago, I had never manually tracked before, and so I downloaded someone else's score sheet. It took me about the first 5 or 6 games of always mistracking the same thing before I realized that instead of 9 eyes on the track list, there were 8 eyes. Well, once I realized that, I could just mentally account for that 9th eye, and my tracking started to improve. However, a few weeks later, I started mistracking on the eyes again. Well, it took me a while to realize that the owner of the score sheet had actually updated it to the proper distribution, and it took me 5 or 6 games before I realized that I finally had to stop accounting for that compensation. Even if you have an accurate tracking list, and I've made sure to triple check the ones I've included in the description, you will likely make mistakes in at least 8 of your first 10 games. And that's why you should start with casual games to get used to the routine of tracking tiles. Some people pick it up a lot faster than others, but like everything else, practice makes perfect. Once you work it into your scoring routine, it will become second nature to you. One way to begin tracking, instead of just diving into accounting for all 100 tiles, is just to worry about the power tiles, blanks, S's, J, Q, X, Z. These 10 tiles takes about 1/10 of the work as tracking everything, but gives you a lot of the useful information that you get out of tile tracking in the end. Making a tile tracking mistake can be pretty costly, not only in the time it takes to find and correct that mistake, but also in all of the suboptimum decisions you make based on that incorrect data. Most experts will insist that you track every word right after you've scored the play, i.e. every turn. This prevents you from forgetting to score a word, aka under-tracking. However, if you're using a clock, tracking on your opponent's time is a pretty good strategy, especially during their particularly lengthy moves. I prefer to put check marks next to words once I've tracked them. This allows me to prevent myself from over or under-tracking a word, and also allows me to not track for multiple turns at a time. Naturally, if you ever think that your tile tracking is going to influence your play, make sure that your tile tracking is up to date, so you're not basing your decisions on old information. Should you detect a mistake in your tile tracking, either it being through a non-match of your physical bag count and your tile tracking bag count, or just towards the end of the game where you go to cross off the Z that was just played and you find it already crossed off, the fix is usually a pretty grueling one, but here's what you should do. If you've under or over tracked multiple tiles, look for a word that you could have skipped or one that you could have tracked twice. If you've over tracked a single tile, look for a word on the board that was played by intersecting a previous word. That letter at the intersection could have been tracked twice. If you've simply mistracked, the culprit is often tracking a blank as a letter it was supposed to represent. Make sure the blanks on the board equal the number of blanks that you've tracked. If you've under-tracked by a single tile, or none of the above were solutions, unfortunately you don't have too many options. You have to start from the beginning and retrack the entire game. Not only a time-consuming, but also a very inaccurate prospect. If you've done your tracking in pencil or pen, then having a crayon or a marker with you can allow you to retrack on the same sheet. Tracking becomes a lot more important in the end game. That much more complicated subject will be discussed in the next video. For now, happy Scrabbling, and good luck on all your games.